Welcome in. Hope you had a fantastic weekend. And we're so excited to have you all here to start off this great week in the NSE. Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 755th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring the Rail's February 2023 Critics Page contributors, Kenneth Brummel, Marianne Caws, Tim Clifford, Jennifer Field, Maria Quinata, Jen Cohen, and Katy Rogers. And we're also thrilled to welcome poet Oscar Vargas here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. And here in New York, we're on Nape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Kennecott Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but they serve as a reminder of place and a reminder of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guests and hosts. Kenneth Brummel is currently the curator of 20th century art at Joslyn Art Museum in Omaha, Nebraska. Marianne Caws is Distinguished Professor Emerita of several literature Ph.D. programs at CUNY. She was the editor of the Yale Anthology of 20th Century French Poetry and chief editor of the HarperCollins World Reader. Tim Clifford is a visual artist based in Brooklyn. With Jack Flam and Katy Rogers, he is co-author of Robert Motherwell, Paintings and Collages, a Catalogue raisonné 1941-1991, and Robert Motherwell 100 Years. Jennifer Field is executive director of the Estate of David Smith. Maria Quinata is the Catalogue raisonné researcher at the Daedalus Foundation and is a PhD candidate at the CUNY Graduate Center. Jennifer Cohen is curator of provenance and research at the Art Institute of Chicago, specializing in modern art and the historical avant-garde. And Katy Rogers, our host and the guest critic, is the program director and director of the Robert Motherwell Catalogue raisonné project at the Daedalus Foundation, where she has worked since 2003. Super grateful to have this amazing group here today, and I'm going to pass it off to Katy to get started.
Thank you, Eleanor. As Eleanor said, my name is Katy Rogers. I want to start with thanking everyone who supported the special critics page for February. That includes the Rail staff, especially Charlie Schultz and Eleanor and Chloe here today, and Feng Bui and the whole team there who really made this a reality, from the design to the editing to the support process throughout. It's really an amazing privilege to work with such an engaged and excited team. Everyone there has really helped us to, again, think about why we talk about Robert Motherwell today. And so I hope that will be part of what we focus on today. I'd also like to thank each of the contributors who are here today, both for lending their insights in their text, but also today in this conversation, which I know will be lively, and there's a lot of interesting things to say. I'd also like to thank the contributors who are not here today, Heidi Kolsman-Freiberger, Edward Kopp, Gregory Gilbert, and Susan Davidson. I recommend, if you have not done so already, please read everyone's text on the Brooklyn Rail website. And the other person who is not here who contributed is Robert Motherwell, of course. And I want to acknowledge him in the room here today. We often talk about Motherwell as the man, and he's a fascinating figure, really at the center of so many interesting things in the 20th century. But today, I really want to focus on his drawing as well. So this critics page came about because the Daedalus Foundation, which was created by Motherwell in 1981 and came into fruition in 1991 at his death, has had as part of our mission to further the understanding of modern art and modernism and modernist principles, but also of Robert Motherwell's work. So our legacy work includes housing his archives, and also working on various catalogs raisonnés. Eleanor referred to both the paintings and collages catalog raisonné that came out in 2012, and then the drawings catalog raisonné was published by Yale University Press in November of 2022. And I'd like to acknowledge Yale University's press in helping support those catalog raisonné projects, and also Trifolio Press in Verona, Italy, who printed both of them. They're beautiful objects. And it's such a pleasure to be able to share this research over the past decades with the public. And when we think about the public at the Daedalus Foundation, it's a very broad understanding, and Motherwell's own understanding of who his public was. It's people in the art world, of course, but it's especially artists and students. It was meant as a space for dialogue, and this is a really wonderful opportunity today. Another thing that relates to the drawings, a few years ago, we started talking with the Menil Drawings Institute about having an exhibition at the same time as the release of the Drawings Catalog Raisonné. And that, again, to use that word again, is such a privilege to have a retrospective exhibition of Motherwell's drawings handled by an incredible institution that was a partner to us throughout. So that exhibition is up for another couple of weeks until mid-March. I recommend, if you find yourself in Houston, that you head on over. It's such a gorgeous exhibition that really shows the true breadth of Motherwell's drawing practice. So I want to, as I mentioned, bring Motherwell into the room. And in his text that was included in the Brooklyn Rail critics page from 1970, you'll see, and we'll talk about this a bit, Motherwell's own ambiguity about defining what drawing was. And I wanted to quote briefly from that. So Motherwell writes, "Drawing is faster than painting, perhaps the only medium as fast as the mind itself." And later he goes on to say, "Painting can overcome one with its sensuousness, like the soft, warm skin of a woman, in a way that drawing cannot. But drawing can be as clear-cut as one's father's precepts. Drawing satisfies our sense for definition, even if we cannot define, quote, drawing itself. Drawing is a racing yacht cutting through the ocean. Painting is the ocean itself." And now I'd like to turn this over to our participants today. And what I had asked everyone to do when we met last week is to start with sharing a brief anecdote about maybe the first time they encountered Motherwell's drawings, or a particularly meaningful encounter with Motherwell's drawings. And I can think of no better person to start than Marianne Caws. So Marianne, if you will.
Katy, thanks so much. Everything you do and say is just so treasured by all of us, especially by me. I loved Robert Motherwell. I remember him well. And I remember and recall very well when we were teaching at Hunter College. He was teaching in philosophy of art, and I was teaching in French. And I asked him to be the art editor for the journal I then edited, very presumptuously entitled Dada Surrealism. And then he accepted, of course. And then I went to hear him and Helen Frankenthaler talk about writing on art. Not long after that, to hear another friend in philosophy, Arthur Danto, speak with Motherwell about one of his paintings called Guillotine of 1996. It was originally entitled Mediterranean Window, and then he saw that the red took over the image. He went back to Guillotine. He often changed the titles of his works and frequently shared those reasons with me. As a native North Carolinian, I was drawn to his Black Mountain Times and stories because my own family had, well, left Scotland for the States, as has his family. Thus, North Carolina and Motherwell, Scotland, were some of our points of contact, among many others. Motherwell phoned me one afternoon to ask me to go over and edit some French translations of his writing and to translate a French book on him, which I did. I was for a long time, very, very long time, translating Motherwell's beloved Mallarmé for New Directions, and we discussed translation and poetry. Rapidly, we had already become friends, and I began writing on his work, completing 2 volumes, Robert Motherwell, What Art Holds, Columbia, 1996, and Robert Motherwell with Pen and Brush, Reaction, 2004. When I was a fellow at the Getty Museum in Center in 1999, I'd come back to Provincetown or Greenwich to speak with him about his work. I loved watching this artist, expansive, as you know, in body and spirit, wield his long and large brushes on his work spread out on the floor, always charting a great openness. I used an interview with Motherwell as a preface for my book on Surrealist painters and poets, and his writing on Joseph Cornell for my edition of Joseph Cornell's Theater of the Mind, selected diaries, letters, and files. I spent many happy days in his studio in Greenwich, speaking with him often about French poetry and about the opens, thinking now and then that the term is exactly the one most appropriate for his approach to everything open, and including the relations between disciplines, text, and image. I loved his saying that I wrote my best essays about art and that he painted his best works about literature. And as an example, you see there his rendering of a Robert Frost tree in my window. So that is Motherwell about literature. All his work engaged that realm of possibilities of which he spoke. His opens, and could I see the opens now? The amazing open. Can we see the open? Yeah, what to say? I mean, so much to say, so much has been said. But let me just say that they have their various tales, many of origin and descriptions. He explained that he'd seen one of his paintings leaning on a larger, more vertical painting and had outlined in charcoal the edges of the small painting on the larger one, creating a door-like image, which of course is like the window, you know, upside down is everything. And his daughter Lise recounts her telling him how the drawing of an open could be freed from the geometric figures in which it was originally inserted, and still other references. Jen Cohen describes the open motif becoming legible as a window in an interior scene, supplemented with two lines to create the illusion of recession. This proliferation of stories and descriptions demonstrates how really open memories and art can both be. On one memorable day, we were looking at his reconciliation elegy. Could I have the next one? There it is. So we were there in his studio looking at that, and he said, oh my goodness, wait, I have to fill in that part. Look at the left part. He had to fill it in. But guess what? It had been commissioned and had already been taken away right after that to the opening in the National Gallery in Washington. So of course he couldn't rectify it then, but then he did rectify it, and you see the next one. Can we see the next one? This is the rectification, as you see. It's untitled, but that's what it is. It's those two elegies are reconciled. I think that's very beautiful. And he also quoted the Walt Whitman poem called Reconciliation. So you have everything all there together, left open, but together. After Motherwell's departure, I was privileged to catalog and read through his remarkably various books about James Joyce, of course, Daedalus Foundation, James Joyce, of course, but many, many others with his annotations. So I read all the annotations in all those various books. I'll always remember him through his talking to me about his reading. Now I'll turn the conversation over to Kenneth Brummel and his discussion of Mallarmé. And I'm thinking also of Heidi Kaufman-Freiberger's writing on Motherwell's celebration of poetry, and Edward Kopp's The Painter and the Poet, including the great Frank O'Hara, with whom Motherwell worked on and whom I love talking about. Let me just say now, to finish, that this all feels as if Motherwell were right here, engaging us all in a very opening conversation, precisely the kind of thing the Brooklyn Rail aims at and never misses. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. It's always a pleasure to hear you speak. And I want to thank you also for invoking the mural in Washington, D.C. I had the pleasure of seeing it in their newly reinstalled East Building. And I hope you have the opportunity to visit because it looks glorious. as readers of the Brooklyn Rail would have noticed, I committed my essay to the problem of Robert Motherwell's lyric suite, which he wrote in 1965. And somewhat coincidentally, that year in 1965, in the February issue of Vogue, in a text on David Smith, which will be the subject of Jennifer Field's discussion today, he mentions the importance of symbolist poetry, Rimbaud, Mallarmé specifically. And he mentions in this text that he written in 1965 how really this was his main preoccupation in the 1940s. And here you can see this lovely collage at the Cleveland Museum of Art, Mallarmé's Swan, one of many works that Motherwell made as a tribute to the great symbolist, poet, and critic. I mention all of this because when the Douglas Foundation and Katy Rogers specifically, and I thank you, Katy, for inviting me to participate both in the publication and in this conversation, asked me to think of the lyric suite and Robert Motherwell's relationship with Helen Frankenthaler, I could not help but think of this attempt on Mallarmé, especially to try to find the foundational rhythms, the rhythmic ground of language through the use of poetry, and how Mallarmé would almost massage words and almost concatenate them to try to capture that energy. And how Robert Motherwell, when he made the lyrical suite by utilizing these inks on horizontally positioned pieces of mulberry paper, how he was trying to capture almost, I would say, the last statement in the bottom right panel of his famous poem, Un coup de dé, which reads, in French, tu penses aimer un coup de dé, or every thought issues from a throw of the dice. And so here's Motherwell using ink to try to capture this chance-like element that Mallarmé was evoking in his poem. But as he was distributing these inks and allowing them through capillary action to flow through these sheets of paper, he somewhat inadvertently captures the technique and reiterates the technique of his lover and then wife, Helen Frankenthaler. And what I find is so magnificent about these drawings, and if we can move to the next slide, please. You'll see how, do you see these orange halations, these bleeds? These oranges are not a distinct ink. This is the separation of elements within the ink itself. And so you have this chance element occurring in these drawings, which are really Robert Motherwell metaphorically rolling the dice, just allowing the ink to ooze. This is way beyond his control. It's a pure chance, psychic automatism. Clearly, this stems from also surrealism and André Breton. If we move to the next slide, but what I find just so uncanny is that when you look at a Frankenthaler painting from maybe 2 years earlier, this is Rock Pond at the Cincinnati Art Museum. If you look especially at the red pour, or if you look at the green pour that is near the upper margin, if you look really closely, you'll notice that you have these discolorations surrounding these areas of color. And just as Robert Motherwell's inks separated and bled and created those orange halations, you have these same separations in Frankenthaler's acrylic on canvas. In other words, the diluted pigments and the acrylic medium separated also and created these same discolorations. And the question I had for myself is how odd that Motherwell, when he created his lyric suite drawings, and there is another lyric suite drawing in the next slide, which I know Jennifer will be using in her lecture, but we'll just use this for now, how when he wanted to completely empty himself of all presuppositions, whether they were a priori, a posteriori, any revisions, it seemed that Frankenthaler surfaced, and I felt, well, this is quite poetic. And I wanted to try to find a way to describe how is it when one tries to completely empty themselves of any bias, of any presuppositions, of any cultural assumptions, that then someone else surfaces. And what I find really remarkable about this is that Robert Motherwell is someone who writes about presence of others as being truly poetic and sublime, and art as a manner whereby one can establish a connectedness with the universe from which we have all been severed. And I think of how he, through these impersonal actions of allowing ink to bleed in paper, how he reconnects with Helen Frankenthaler, how he reconnects with, as Jennifer Field will argue, with David Smith, but also how he reconnects with Mallarmé, with surrealism and the world. And I guess for me, what I just find so romantic in this moment of emptying oneself, one becomes, however phantasmatically, however indirectly, one becomes unified with one's surround, a unified or surround from which we've all been severed. And I guess that's the real romance of the lyric suite for me. But I think what's also I find so romantic about this is that, you know, Motherwell even writes about marriage once, where he describes marriage as an ideal relationship in which someone else is able to sustain an integrity that you would not be able to sustain alone. And so it's odd that in this moment where he completely empties himself, he almost becomes unified with his spouse. And I just felt that I needed to capture that paradox, but also that romance and that exhilaration in the short essay I submitted. And how did I get involved with Motherwell? Well, I grew up as a teenager in Chicago, and there's a fantastic picture there, the wall painting stripes in 1944. And you can see how Motherwell, and this relates to Marianne's point about the mural in Washington, D.C., how you can see he revises and scrapes and paints and repaints, and you can see the underlying composition peeking through the surface composition. And it raised at this very young age for me, this whole question of when are you finished? When can you finish? Are you able ever to finish? Will I finish? And that painting was one that always really stayed with me. But I think my first intimate engagement with the Motherwell drawing was when I was a curator at the Art Gallery of Ontario, and I had a chance to actually have a few examples of the lyric suite horizontally placed on a shelf in front of me. And I was able to actually physically relate to these sheets of paper the way Motherwell related to them when he made them. And I think that for me was a real revelation. But I want to introduce our next guest, Jennifer Field, who will be discussing Robert Motherwell's relationship with David Smith. And I look forward to hearing what you have to say, Jennifer. And thank you everyone for your time.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Kenneth. That was a great lead-in. And I want to thank Eleanor for your support today. And thank you to the Daedalus Foundation and Brooklyn Rail for inviting me to contribute to the critics page and also to participate in today's event. I'm glad we're on this slide because this is the drawing that I wanted to focus on today. And there are two reasons. One is, for me, it exemplifies the idea of drawing as, quote, between, which is something that Jennifer Cohen wrote about in her Brooklyn Rail text when she described the medium of drawing for Robert Motherwell as having a capacity, this is quotation, to establish a sense of the between. I take this to mean between mediums, in this case, between painting and drawing, which we see here and in so many of Motherwell's drawings, and even between sculpture. We've had some conversations about really the volume in Motherwell's drawings and his careful attention to the support and sense of depth, and how there's a lot of variation in that sense of space. And so it is sort of a bridge between mediums. I also read these drawings as existing between art and language. And Kenneth, I think that speaks to what you were just describing. I was reading Robert Motherwell's thoughts on drawing from 1970. He described drawing as a racing yacht cutting through the ocean, and painting as the ocean itself. And I felt like this drawing really sort of illustrates that in the way that the drawn line and the painted areas exist in relation to each other. This work is done in ink, pastel, and graphite. So there's actually no real paint, but it definitely has a painterly quality. And another reason why I wanted to focus on this drawing is because it relates to how I came to be introduced rather recently to Motherwell's drawings through the beautiful catalog Raisonné that was just published, but also it represents an example from a body of work in which Motherwell and David Smith and Helen Frankenthaler were communicating with one another, which is something I wrote about in the Brooklyn Rail. So for me, their artwork exists on a plane separate from their postcards and their letters and the photographs of them all together. And there are ample examples of that material. But there was also a dialogue occurring in their artwork throughout, in parallel to that more overt correspondence, which I'll talk about in a minute. In addition to this kind of brushy areas in the painting and the drawn lines that we see, there is staining here on the left, which refers back to the influence of surrealism and especially Mata in Robert Motherwell's work. Mata was sort of a mentor to Motherwell for a period, and staining was a way of engaging the subconscious among a group of the surrealist artists. So that's very important in Motherwell's drawings. And for the drawn lines, I think of automatism, another surrealist device, of course, and also Motherwell's admiration for children's drawings, which Heidi wrote about in her text for the Brooklyn Rail. And if you look beyond these stained and brushed on surfaces, you can see this sort of, these curved lines, maybe resembling or evoking a stick figure, maybe the mane of a lion, which is actually an illustration that Heidi used in her text in the Rail. This is kind of combination of techniques reminds me of examples that we see starting to emerge in Motherwell's drawing practice in the late 1950s. And that's around the time that he started dating Helen Frankenthaler. So Kenneth, thank you for mentioning her. We can see this combination of line and staining in Frankenthaler's own work, even in the large painting Mountains and Sea from 1952. Motherwell and Frankenthaler began dating in 1957. They married in 1958. And Frankenthaler's first solo exhibition took place in New York at the Jewish Museum in 1960. That's the year that this painting is dated and was presumably made, although we can't say exactly when it was made, but it is dated 1960. So I love that kind of relationship and the echoes of techniques that occur between both artists. And there's also this feeling, which I believe really activates the work, of it being fundamentally unresolved. And I think the mural study that was just shown is sort of, we can think about that work in relation to this smaller drawing, with the bar on the right here being filled in, the bars on the left, and this sense that it's a very active surface and it continues to unfold for us in the present day. There's a real tension that sort of manifests here. And the second reason I wanted to focus on this work is because of its communicative potential. Motherwell wrote, when you think of the medium of drawing as having the same potential as another human being, it's something that Katy wrote in her editorial comment in the Rail, it leads to a conversation. And in fact, this drawing is inscribed for Rebecca and Candida, our Motherwell 1960. Rebecca and Candida were David Smith's daughters. And the families visited each other through the late 1950s and early 1960s in Bolton Landing. Frankenthaler and Motherwell visited David Smith and his family in Bolton Landing. David Smith would visit Frankenthaler and Motherwell in New York City. They would travel to Provincetown to visit Frankenthaler and Motherwell on Cape Cod. So a sense of place was very important to both artists, as we know from Motherwell's work and how he would try to capture the energy of the spray of the ocean hitting the bulkhead in Cape Cod outside his home by using his own full body force against the paper. This drawing is in a private collection, and it's been shown only once in 1976 at the Hyde Collection in Glens Falls, New York, which is about 20 minutes from David Smith's home in Bolton Landing. So for me, this is a message from Motherwell through Rebecca and Candida to David Smith, and just, it's a tribute to their friendship. It's a message that sort of has been carried over to us through the decades, and I find it really meaningful. And if we could, Eleanor, go to the next slide. I wanted to show an example of a David Smith work, which was made in response to Robert Motherwell. And the curator at the National Gallery, E.A. Carmine, recalled from a conversation with Robert Motherwell that Smith was encouraging him to make a sculpture. And Robert Motherwell said, well, I wouldn't know really how to do that. And this was Smith's response to the elegies for the Spanish Republic. So this is David Smith's sculptural response, this gondola work. So there are other examples of drawings that I think are really wonderful by both artists, sometimes inscribed, sometimes it's fun to just think about, you know, the timing that they were made. Was there a recent visit? What was this ongoing correspondence and relationship through visual art that existed separately from their written correspondence? And with that, I would like to turn this over to Jennifer Cohen.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. And I want to just share in the chorus of thanks to Katy and Eleanor as well for the invitation, not only to write, but to speak here today. And thanks to everyone who came to visit us midday and have this conversation together. So I wanted to sort of start with a response to Katy's question and use that prompt as a way to get into my the images that I reproduced in my essay. So in terms of my first encounter with Motherwell's work, of course, understanding his role in every art history 101 course, as a scholar of surrealism, I first became more immersed in his work, sort of beyond the Documents of Modern Art series during a curatorial research fellowship that I held in the Department of Photography, actually, about some 10 years ago. So I was invited by a close colleague to make a selection of objects to view in the Prints and Drawings study room. And just as a side note, this is something that anyone can do at any time. It's a wonderful resource that we have here at the Art Institute. So I was looking first for prints done in Hayter's studio, but I never got that far because as I was looking through the artists that I knew had worked in Hayter's studio, Raphael Alberti's name leapt out at me as the author of Motherwell's artist book, Alla Pintura. And that was published in an edition of 40 folios of 21 unbound intaglio prints that Motherwell worked on between 1968 and 72 at Universal Limited Art Editions, or ULAE, in Long Island. And just as a parenthetical to note, his thoughts on drawing essay was published at the exact midpoint between these dates. So Alberti was an avant-garde literary figure, sometimes associated with the Surrealist impulse in Spain, who, like Federico Garcia Lorca, was known for his play with avant-garde or with outmoded literary form. So they likewise looked back to the Spanish Baroque as inspiration for their work. So, like I said, my knowledge of Motherwell was limited at this point, but something as I looked through this book clicked for me about his work. These printed illustrations of this expansive, this ode to the medium of painting that goes through the implements of painting and focuses largely otherwise on color. So I felt like this had something to say about his sort of everything that proved difficult and limiting about the categorization of Motherwell as an abstract expressionist painter. So his gravitation towards the space between media and sort of the retrospective impulse that really spanned his career. So the Art Institute stewards the ULAE archive, and that includes more than 4,000 drawings, trial and working proofs, and other unique archival materials from a range of Motherwell's contemporaries. And around 10% of that archive relates to the Alla Pintura project. And the most evocative materials there, I think, really are his drawings and occasionally the textiles, which served as color or textural inspiration for his prints. So my essay explores the role of what I'm calling drawing painting, so to speak. And you can see that here in this object. So the role that plays in his thought process for the illustration of a certain, so one page of this book, which is an ode to the palette as an implement of painting. So I feel like this leads Motherwell to a really surprisingly extreme challenge to painting right at the outset of this book. And this is one of the earliest drawings made for this for this particular page. And you can see he's working with the open format, this open rectangular form, and a very lightly penciled in circular abstract representation of a palette. And right at the outset, I was so intrigued by the way that he was these painted these drawn daubs of paint recall the printer's primaries, so cyan, yellow, and magenta. And then you can go to the next slide to a subsequent print that he made, just thinking through how to illustrate a painter's palette in his way. He very quickly moves to an open format, which is located in what's identifiable to us, I think, as an interior space with yet another sort of palette of colors that you can see as if they're hovering across the floor. I thought it was really interesting the way that this piece in particular located, and also the project as a whole, located the opens in the context of Spanish walls and 3 dimensions considered more broadly. He spoke of the way that the copper plate left a 3-dimensional impression on the page. And then lastly, you can see in the final print, if you move to the next slide, that he's replaced the palette completely with an impression of a torn corner of Black Japanese paper, with over here on the right, you can see the Spanish language original text from Alberti. That itself takes on the iconographic role of the palette in this piece. So of course, I think about the way that this torn piece of paper recalls other avant-garde predecessors for collage practice that Motherwell, of course, knew well, but I think also the tradition of monochrome painting. So you think immediately of the black square. And then bringing us back full circle to drawing, I'm interested in sort of Kenneth's thoughts on the use of Japanese paper here in relation to his choice of a similar ground for his lyric suite. Of course, Motherwell was very attentive to paper choice. And so, we often think of the lyric suite in relation to his ongoing interest in surrealist automatism. But I think what this whole project actually makes really clear is that his connection to the surrealist movement is much, much deeper and more multifaceted than merely sort of his automatic use of line. So even on the level of form or medium, and of course it confirms that drawing is really inextricably linked to each and every medium that he was practicing. So I look forward to this conversation and your questions. And with that, I'll turn it over to Maria.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you to Eleanor and the Brooklyn Real team for organizing and facilitating this conversation, and to Katy for bringing us all in dialogue with one another. I'll speak briefly on my connection to Motherwell's drawings. As a researcher on the catalog raisonné of drawings team here at the Daedalus Foundation, my entry point to Motherwell and his world is maybe more obvious than others. I research and focus primarily on all known exhibitions and references of him and his work, with a particular emphasis on his drawings. And it is through these materials that an ever-shifting public image of Motherwell takes shape. One of the most interesting and compelling aspects of this research process is tracking and distilling how other people, scholars, curators, students, critics, artists, and writers encounter him, and how he is evaluated over time and the ebbs and flows of his public reception, how he becomes a conduit and an entry point into all these other worlds, including, as we've seen today, poetry, literature, and other artists such as Mata, David Smith, and Helen Frankenthaler. I bring up this drawing, and could we go to a to space, please? Thank you. I bring up this drawing in particular, which I wrote about in my contribution to the rail. As an example, we know only through its appearance in the 1942 issue of Dine, the dissident surrealist magazine produced by Wolfgang Paalen, as an entry point into how Mexico figures into his work and how Motherwell's distillation of the vibrant colors and landscapes he encounters there converges with his encounters with European abstraction in the early 1940s through significant exhibitions of Miro, Kandinsky, Matisse, Mondrian, and Picasso. And this drawing serves as an entry point into a collision of different spaces, geographies, and temporalities. Part of what a catalogue raisonné attempts to do is historicize and reanimate these encounters and to make them legible and relevant to a range of audiences. We continue to think about how his drawings perform as entry points into past and future encounters and the possibilities these counters may bring forth. How they continue to perform as after images of Motherwell's personal encounters with Mexico, Mallarmé, James Joyce, David Smith, Frankenthaler. The connections and links and encounters seem never ending and collides with the visual pleasures of spending time with his drawings. This one in particular, one thinks of the rich passages of intense and varying shades of purple, the black threads that create and delineate spatial fields that hint at other dimensions and other worlds. Thank you. And now I turn it over to Tim.
Hi, and thank you. I'm Tim Clifford, and I actually started work at the Daedalus Foundation the same month as Katy Rogers. So we've been in a 20-year conversation about Motherwell's work. And Katy's background was in art history, and my background is as an artist, but I came to the project, I entered it as a job, but with an interest in Motherwell's sort of hinge point in 20th century American art. And my first introduction before that project was Motherwell's anthology of the Dada painters and poets, which was published in 1951, but he actually began work on in 1944 when he began with Wittenborn Schultz, the Documents of Modern Art series, which was intended to bring low-cost editions of writings by artists to an American public in translation. And the project kind of grew out of control over the years, and what started as a translation of one essay became an ever-expanding volume that they finally got out 7 years later. But I bring this up because Motherwell's interest in Dada coincided with these first two drawings that I'm going to discuss. And between 1942 and 1944, Motherwell had become friendly with many of the major European artists who had arrived in New York in exile from the war in Europe. And in trying to understand the origins of surrealism, they all pointed him back to Dada. And at that time, he could find very little about Dada written in English, save for Alfred Barr's 1936 exhibition catalog. And one of the things that both that Max Ernst and Andre Masson told him is that during the war, they may have been, literally on either side of the front lines as a German and a French soldier shooting at each other. And that when they left the army, Dada was, the reaction of this generation that did survive the horrors of the First World War, and it really was a rebellion against every value that Europe had professed to represent, and they saw the First World War as just an annihilation of everything that was supposed to be honorable and decent in European culture. So that was the sort of the political context in which Dada arose, in which Motherwell immersed himself. So Motherwell's first exhibition, solo exhibition in New York, occurred at Peggy Guggenheim's Art of the Century Gallery in October 1944. And in the months preceding that, he created this drawing, Three Figures Shot, which is in the collection of the Whitney Museum in New York, and about 25 to 30 other drawings, either directly or adjacent to this theme, which here you can see three figures, these segmented figures standing, and the red, is literally meant to represent the blood spatter. And Motherwell had been reading deeply about the Mexican Revolution. His wife at the time was Mexican, had grown up in Los Angeles, but had family in Mexico City, and her uncle had fought with Pancho Villa. So he had heard stories from Maria, as well as her mother and grandmother when they were in Mexico City, and had collected a lot of images of postcards and photographs from this war, which often showed, figures lined up for firing squads by the Mexican army, the rebel forces being lined up. So this drawing is dated June 6th, 1944, which was D-Day. And Matthew Skopek, the conservator at the Whitney, has shared that when you study the drawing, the edges, you can see sort of on the right edge of this, there's a blue tint, and that originally this drawing was done primarily in shades of red, white, and blue. So there was a very, very strong sort of acknowledgement of the political reality on the ground in Europe at that time, as well as, looking to this history of conflict in the 20th century. And Motherwell kind of pursued this thread of these kind of political images throughout the 1940s. We found evidence of a painting series that was sort of never fully realized, called The Walls of Europe. And there's sort of this tension in his work between sort of putting forth the political content and sort of concealing it. And that was both, I think it was both a commercial situation where his dealers reacted poorly to the express political nature of his work, and also just the complex politics of the 1940s, where most of his contemporaries had served on the WPA. Motherwell was too young and came to New York after that activity, but a lot of his contemporaries, such as Rothko and Basiotis and Pollock, were turned off by the kind of pressure to create works that adhered to a specific political program in the 30s, and wanted to pursue abstraction as a sign of independence. So this work, which he titled The Redness of Red, at one moment he describes as a purely abstract work, but in the context of these works done in 44, one can read it very clearly as the central oval as a head, the black shadow below it as kind of framing the neck, and then the red splatters again as the signs of blood. And specifically, it relates to an earlier painting of Motherwell's called Recuerdo de Coyoacán, which this was sort of never discussed in Motherwell's lifetime, but in researching his correspondence and his early writings that were found in the foundation, we found reference to this as specifically addressing the assassination of Leon Trotsky in the Coyoacan neighborhood of Mexico City in 1940, the year before Motherwell traveled there. And so the title, The Redness of Red, both alludes to the innate quality of red, which Motherwell thought that we all only understood red through the associations that we brought to it, whether it be blood, wine, the red of a rose. All these sensations that we experienced formed our aesthetic and emotional reaction to its appearance in the work of art. So while it can be read as a very abstract work, it also has this somewhat veiled or somewhat hidden content. And by the late 40s, if you can go to the final image, the elegy drawing. Yeah, so this is the first drawing in the Elegy to the Spanish Republic series, which was done originally to illustrate a poem by Harold Rosenberg for a publication he, Motherwell, John Cage, and the architect Pierre Charot were editing. And again, it ties back to what both Marianne and Kenneth and Jen Cohen talked about, Motherwell's deep connection to poetry, to the written word, and finding a visual equivalent for his response to events in the world itself. And so this, this drawing began, as a very kind of spontaneous reaction to Rosenberg's poem, and then was, visually he took just the bottom half of the drawing and made a small painting the following year, and eventually developed it into the Elegy to the Spanish Republic series. And in my essay, I wanted to kind of address this fact that, partially it was Motherwell's youth, but partially it was his own understanding of what modern art was, in terms of a response to an art that was specifically made in response to the moment that the artist was living in, to the present time, that convinced him that abstraction was not only a legitimate, but potentially the most powerful response that an artist could have to events, both positive and negative, in their life and in their world. So I have a quote here from Motherwell in 1946, which he says, "The activity of the artist makes him less socially conditioned and more human. It is then that he is disposed to revolution. Society stands against anarchy. The artist stands for the human against society. Society therefore treats him as an anarchist. Society's logic is faulty, but its intimation of an enemy is not." So Motherwell very much saw his work and that of his colleagues as standing against the false values of his contemporary culture, the post-war, sort of American-centric. He very much valued an international culture that looked past borders, that looked past nationalities, and really emphasized, the sort of common human element. In a series of exchanges, a series of lectures and panel discussions throughout the 40s and 50s, he was constantly paired up with the painter Ben Shahn, and they had sort of a mutual, not hostility personally, but just a very strong difference of opinion in terms of the role of art and the value of abstraction, where Sean saw Motherwell as making sort of meaningless works that were just purely decoration. Motherwell felt that Sean's work was just propaganda, which started where the idea existed prior to the idea that Sean was painting towards was something that existed prior to his approaching the canvas, where Motherwell saw drawing and his other mediums as a way to discover something new, as a push to advance knowledge and create something that had never been seen before, which was in itself a political statement. But through these works such as Three Figure Shot, and then in the Elegy series and in collages from the 70s, such as the several collages that were dedicated to Salvador Allende, he consistently went back to this political dimension and sort of never hid it, although he did not see the work itself as political, in titling these works and positioning them in line as either elegies, memorials to situations that he felt strongly about. He admitted that politics was part of his life just as much as pleasure was, and so it had room in his art. And I think he very much advanced an idea that allowed abstraction to formed a kind of an underpinning where abstraction could be used for not used for social means, but could express an artist's full response to the world in which they lived. And I guess so. Are we going to open it up?
Thank you, Tim. I found very interesting as a theme throughout this conversation today. Marianne talked about the idea of openness and how open memories and art can be, and others talked about drawing as a between space, a space of ambiguity. When is it finished? When are we finished? I liked that, Kenneth, that sense of possibility and ambiguity. Maria talked about it in the sense of research as well. I think the phrase also fundamentally unresolved. I think Jennifer Field mentioned that. I think that's a really interesting place to start. To talk about Motherwell's drawings. And I think there may have been some questions about that in the chat that might be brought forward too. But I wondered if anyone might like to a little bit more their understanding of ambiguity in Motherwell's practice, or in the practice of those artists that he was interested in, whether they be visual artists, poets, or other.
I'll jump in, which is to say that I think Motherwell, there's a comment he made that an artistic medium is the only thing in human existence that has the same range of feeling that people themselves do. So he really saw both drawing and his other works as a direct way to express directly both his humanness, but also to seek a connection with that in the viewer, and that had broad implications within his philosophy. I think Gregory Gilbert in his essay on Motherwell, and William James, Motherwell came to abstraction with this underpinning that understood the importance of the individual and their how they interfaced with the world and interfaced with others. And he found a language and drawing that was the most immediate expression of his effort to fulfill that.
And building from that, we can look at this slide, which, as you can see, is titled Open Number 121, Bolton Landing Elegy. Bolton Landing was the town where David Smith lived full-time for the last 25 years of his life, up in the Adirondack Mountains of New York State. And the place was integral to Smith's practice in all mediums. And Motherwell, was in the process of making the lyric suite when David Smith died suddenly of a car accident in 1965. And then that series came to a halt, and Motherwell never picked it up again. It was several years later, Katy, I believe you write about this in the Drawings Catalog Raisonné, that Motherwell made this painting, this open painting, and realized this was the most adequate expression of his sense of loss and grief that he had found in losing David Smith 4 years prior. So here's an example of, painting in charcoal on canvas that sort of came first, and then the emotion followed soon after. And so that's a great example of the relationship between communication and between emotion, between art, maybe that Tim was just sort of describing.
Jennifer, I have a question for you, and maybe also for Katy. This was a question when Edward Cope visited me in Toronto when preparing for his exhibition. I asked him, would you include an open painting, especially one with one of these charcoal rectilinear elements? Given that we know that Motherwell defines drawing as the division of a surface plane. Obviously, this picture, which you so beautifully described, Jennifer, is painted with a very thin black and gray black pigment, but we have this charcoal element that is drawn on the canvas. And I wonder, Katy, Jennifer, if you have any thoughts on this inscription of drawing, but on the support of painting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think, here we come back to that ambiguity again as well. And in Motherwell's own practice, and this was something that we struggled with a bit in terms of dealing with the body of work from such a prolific artist. So between the Catalogue Raisonné of paintings, collages, and paintings on paper, and then drawings, we're talking about 4,500 works, and then his prints and things as well. In Motherwell himself, in his own studio, things would shift. They would be defined as a drawing or a painting on paper, and they would change over time. I think Marianne alluded to that as well. Titles would change, the surface would change. Nothing was static for him. For us, we felt that there was something very different about the way that graphic media was executed on paper, or sometimes like a flexible plastic sheet, like a mylar, than say paint on a similar support. So we drew the line there, but that is not something necessarily that Motherwell had a hard line on. And something Edward and I talked about when he was looking at the drawings is something the Menil does, is that they define drawing very broadly. And I think for the Daedalus Foundation, that was really exciting. The idea that he included collages, and I think someone mentions in the chat, maybe we'll get to it, about the relationship between the drawings and the collages, how Motherwell might consider drawing with paper. And he also lamented the fact that just practically speaking, the market devalues drawings. And he felt like some of these things were the best work he had ever made. And yet the market or curators might feel that they were of less value, either in terms of historically or financially. And I think that speaks to, for Motherwell, it wasn't a hierarchy within his practice. I don't know if Jen wanted to say anything.
No, I definitely felt like you were the best equipped to answer that question.
I have I have one comment, if I can, in terms of the opens, which is in their relation to drawing, which is that Motherwell's drawing throughout his career were often done, you know, a series in great quantity, like the 1944 drawings, where there's, you know, 30 to 40 drawings created in several months, and later you might get 30 to 40 drawings created in a single week, because they were, you know, the most direct route to the kind of automatous thing. And there's something about the opens where, you know, they really are the sort of the perfect marriage for him of painting and drawing. And so you get that quote that in the Thoughts on Drawing about, you know, drawing is the ship on the sea, and painting is the ocean. I mean, that's very specifically done in the middle, written during this period of the opens. And I mean, within 3 years, Motherwell creates over 200 paintings in this series, along with dozens of drawings, and begins the Alla Pintura print project. And so there is something about the simplicity of, you know, the subtle preparation of these huge grounds, but then the immediacy of, you know, these three rectilinear lines. And I mean, I think from our perspective, they seem very simple, but Larry Rubin, who ran Knowler, which was Motherwell's gallery in the 70s and 80s, said that the first time Richard Diebenkorn saw the opens, he just said, "Does Bob think he can get away with this?" Like they seemed so effortless and so, you know, just quick and simple, but philosophically, as Marianne talked about, it's this very complex idea of what you know, a painting can be, or a drawing can be. So I mean, there's something about that sudden moment of inspiration that carries over from his drawings into that series as well.
Mm-hmm. I also was thinking, when Marianne was speaking about the reconciliation elegy, it's an enormous work, but there's a lot of drawn elements to it. And in the studio, there's photographs of him painting on the floor in the studio. And he had these small shelves running along the walls, so in the studio, so he could lean up other works while he was working. And it was very important to him to have his own works there for inspiration. But there are photographs that show the lyric suite, several lyric suites up along the wall, while the reconciliation elegy is down on the floor. And I think, you know, that's that thing where these appear to be very different kinds of practices or images, but in fact, they are very related to each other.
And what you were saying, Katy, about, you know, ambiguity and ambivalence and all that incompletion is so beautifully everywhere. I mean, you feel it all through Motherwell's being. You know, he loved to talk about, well, everything, but everything would merge into everything, like that study of space we saw. It felt, to me, it was like one of the greatest things I ever knew after French poetry. I mean, you know, he was like French poetry for me, and that's saying everything.
Did any of the other panelists have any questions for each other before we open it up? No? Okay.
I just want to say something about the open series, which the more it's discussed in this forum and at the Manil, the more intrigued I am by it, because I think that achieving variation in monochromatic fields and with such minimal structure and structural intervention with the drawn line must be extremely challenging. And I see them as very difficult works, not difficult to digest, but difficult to have made, I would think. It's something that Barnett Newman accomplished within his paintings in the early phase of his career, and then within series in the second phase of his career. When you look at paintings like Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue, and which are all primaries, but he made them with different types of paint to achieve very subtle variations in the surface. And it's sort of this myth of abstract expressionism that, these monochromatic or supposedly minimalist works ran counter to how ABEX had been defined up to this point. And it also, throughout Motherwell's work, this myth of separation between mediums is constantly challenged and undone. And we see it with David Smith also, whose drawing was inseparable really from his painting sculptural practice. We see it with de Kooning. We see it with Pollock. So anyway, just wanted to make that comment about the opens, which I find some of the most fascinating works.
I agree, Jennifer. I think that they're working sort of at the highest level, that they completely function as color field paintings in that sort of discussion, at the same time that they are completely undoing medium separation on every level. So not only painting and drawing, I think with few exceptions there, they do include charcoal drawing, but thinking about that, the open motif as in terms of the origin story that Mary Ann related, we can also, I think about that as collage, or almost like interacting with the medium of print, in that they are traced and that they're indexical, and they sort of, they bring in the found, the registration of something that had been on top of it. So I think in that way, they're super, super smart. And going back to Katy's question, they're ambiguous, yes, but they're incredibly pointed and intelligent in their ambiguity.
Absolutely. Eleanor, should we open it up to the audience?
Yeah, I think that would be great. Thank you so much, all of you, for this incredibly rich conversation. It's been so amazing to see your writing kind of come to life. So thank you so much again. We've got a bunch of really great questions from the audience today. And the first question I will be asking on behalf of Tom McGlynn. Tom McGlynn wrote in the chat, how do Motherwell's collages relate to his drawings, excuse me. How do Motherwell's collages relate to his drawings?
Kenneth, I wonder if you want to start with that. You had included a collage in your conversation, and it is a collage that has a great deal of drawing in it, but I think it's maybe more than that.
I would never, Katy, pretend to have the knowledge you have of Motherwell and collage, but I will hazard a guess. And I go back to that passage in which he describes how he has this vision of Mallarmé and Mallarmé's studio, and how Mallarmé is massaging the words of language. He's taking linguistic material and he's massaging it and trying to concatenate it so as to establish a connection with the universe. And I think of Motherwell tearing sheets and fitting them together, or even fitting a sheet with a drawn passage on a support, and creating these contiguities in order to generate both his sensation of a response to an object. I guess, Motherwell being a symbolist, he's not depicting an object, he's depicting a response to an object. And how he's attempting to encapsulate that through these, for lack of a better word, metonymic contiguities, this arrangement of objects on a support, or even, depicted or literal objects. And I see that there's an immediacy and a spontaneity to the production of those relationships in collage, and even the, creating these, I would have to say, these collisions between different elements, whether they are, ink on a support, or a drawn element with a graphite, or a pasted sheet. And I think this is how the spontaneity that can obtain in drawing, I think also can obtain in collage. And I think that is how I view the relationship, but I might be wrong.
I think that's a wonderful interpretation as well. And I think for Motherwell, you know, he talks about how his love of paper and how he was surrounded by more paper in his life than anything else, whether that be books or beautiful drawing papers. And I think that, you know, when we talk about his writing and his editing, he would write on these large sheets of, say, like a Strathmore paper, and they are themselves, they are objects themselves, but they blur that line between object and word. And we've talked about that in other drawings as well, like that, the poetry with the first elegy that Tim showed, as well as the Alla Pintura. I mean, I think that relationship with medium is very fluid for him, and there are drawn elements in the collages, but I think he would probably say he draws with paper as well.
Yeah.
I just say, in his hotel rooms, he would put up great bunches of paper on which he would write as if they were paintings. I love that. Happened all the time.
Yeah. I was going to say, he talks about with his drawings and his collages that or his paintings, all of his work, but you know, a painting might start with a pool or a paint or a gesture, and a collage would just start with, you know, a simple piece of paper placed on, you know, a canvas support or a paper support, and that at that moment, that's where the you know, the game began, like the struggle between how things. So I mean, I think his approach was very different, though it was medium specific. But I think, and it changes in different periods. I mean, Motherwell's collages of different periods have a very different role, but particularly in the later years, collage and drawing have this very direct and, you know, much, you know, that's like the direction that the spontaneity in his work really comes out in terms of a playful, you know, a playful sense of working with a medium. So.
Katy, I have a question. I mean, you and I have had this conversation, especially around the 1957 collages, where he incorporates papers from his travels, specifically when he visited Canada. And I wonder if, you know, one could make the argument that there is something similarly diaristic between the collages and the drawings. And I'm not sure if anyone has a response to that. I'm not asking for any kind of literalism here, but, you know, I cannot help but ignore that in the collages, the detritus of his life, you know, their way into the matrix of art. And I'm wondering if anyone has a response to this.
I love that idea. You know, something that has been brought up a little bit is the idea of after image for Motherwell, the way that you absorb and then express all of the things you absorb. So that could be something very literal, like a specific image in his Joyce sketchbook drawings. There you can see, you know, towers in Ireland and other things like that. But, you know, it can be an impression of a poet, a poem, music, as in the lyric suite. He talks about that. So I do think the drawings themselves do tend to be, I like the word diaristic. He talks a bit about the collages being more biographical because they do have that literal element of pulling things, mailing labels that have his address on them, things that are extremely literal, but not necessarily to the viewer themselves. You know, they may not necessarily know, unless it's Motherwell's address, what this collage means, this element, this cigarette pack, often a Gauloise. What does that stand for Motherwell? But it is there, and that intent is there. But I'd love to hear what anyone else has to say.
Communication.
Absolutely. I think Jen said communicative potential, which I wrote down, which I thought was really a nice way to put it.
If there Oh, sorry, Jen, did you want to jump in?
Sorry, the director of our museum just walked in on me. So, yeah, I missed the last part because of that. But this whole conversation was making me recall. I wonder if anyone, maybe from the Catalog Raisonné team, has any thoughts on the Madrid suite in relationship to this intersection between collage and drawing and diaristic tendencies, but just the idea that in this, the foundation of the series was a rubbing of the texture of Motherwell's hotel room in Madrid during his honeymoon visit. I wonder if rubbing ever comes up in his drawing again, or if that brings up anything for you, just in terms of, like, again, drawing in relation to indexicality.
I don't think drawing appears terribly much in his work, although in some of the larger paintings, you'll get impressions of the floorboards. But it's interesting that, I mean, that rubbing brings him right back to that kind of, right back to like Max Ernst and that early Dada impulse, where you're bringing in things that are the texture of a wall, something that has no meaning of itself, but then incorporating it into this. And once you know the circumstances in which he made it, on his honeymoon, on his last night in Madrid before he fled the country, because he was told that he basically wasn't welcome because of the
Sorry, I think you're muted.
Oh, I got muted there. So I don't know if anyone heard what happened. Where did I cut off there?
About why he was fleeing the country.
Oh yeah, just leaving Madrid. He was there for his honeymoon, but there was an exhibition, the New American Painting, which included an elegy to the Spanish Republic, but the government wouldn't let it be shown under that title. And he wanted all his work removed from the exhibition. It's a long story, but I mean, it's a very charged moment, but its record is this impression in the same way that the collages might include something that means nothing to nobody else. For him, it's this trace of history.
And I think for those as well, to sort of go back to the sort of cyclical relationship between his media and then his motifs, at the center of those drawings that Jen's alluding to, there's a triangle with two ovals inside of it. And that motif appears first in a drawing in the mid-40s. And then it comes back again in the late 40s. And then it comes back here in this very meaningful moment. And then he uses that image in a suite of prints. And so, and that also shows up in the Je t'aime paintings as well from the mid-50s. So, if you trace through Motherwell, you can see how he takes an image and he reinterprets it, and he revitalizes it as well through these different media. And often, not always, but often there's a drawing component that's at the root.
Jen Cohen asked a question earlier about the choice of the mulberry paper and the lyric suite. And I guess since we're discussing fortuity, what I find remarkable, and I think I read this somewhere, he describes how the grain of the mulberry, the uneven graininess in the paper, and how that can become a part of the composition. And so you do have this fortuitous encounter between the stained ink and the way the paper is grained, and how that graining can enrich and enliven the surface. And I don't know if you have any comments on that, Katy, but I mean, even at the level of the support, he's embedding chance when you think of, and he is a papyrophiliac. And so I guess, he was really, sensitive to just how the grain, could arbitrarily just be embedded in the composition. And I mean, I find it somewhat ingenious that, even at the choice of the paper, he relished the different textures of the paper depending on the grain.
Well, I mean, he talks about the medium as a collaborator. And so, the way he chose his supports and his media shows that relationship as a collaboration, that he is not entirely in control ever. And I think for those particular sheets, they're made of a mulberry fiber. And so the fibers is called dragon cloud, but it's quite beautiful, and each sheet is unique. So even though, he had originally set out to make 1,000 of these, he had 1,000 sheets of paper, each of the works he would have no control over exactly how the ink would spread. And those fibers over time is interesting. You can still buy this paper, and it's a very sort of soft, flexible paper. It had been during his life called a rice paper, but it's a mulberry paper. And when you buy it, it's more the fibers and the ground are more similar in color, and over time they age differently, and those fibers become a little shinier and they stand out differently, and the paper becomes a little more brittle. And so that age has almost heightened it a little bit on some of the works that have been out in the public more often.
So in the corner of paper that I illustrated from the archive, you can really see that he's relishing the way that those fibers are kind of, as that corner is torn, the fibers are kind of trailing off, and you see that in the imprint. And all of a sudden, in the course of this conversation, I'm seeing the blackness of that paper as sort of itself a representation of paper embedded with ink, and which again, of course, in the print becomes, ink on paper again. So it's super, super smart. And thanks to you both for helping me think this through.
Reminds me of Masson, at the same period, putting sand in the fiber. So all of this was so present in Motherwell's mind, all that kind of integration of the exterior into what he was doing.
Thank you so much for those really amazing answers. That was such a generative question, Tom. So shout out. Thank you so much. I know we did receive a few more questions, but for the sake of time, we are going to move on to our final question. And if you would like your question to be addressed, please feel free to reach out to events@brooklynrail.org after this. It's been such a fruitful conversation. So thanks again to all of the contributors here. Our final question before we move over to a poetry reading will be from Phong Bui. You're muted, Phong.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, Marianne. Thank you, Jennifer, Kenneth, Tim, of course, Jen, and the great guest critic for the last issue, February issue, Katy. Yes, I always wanted to ask this question, partly because we know how Motherwell have studied philosophy at Harvard. We know he has studied with, for example, Arthur Lovejoy, who founded the famous Journal of the History of Ideas, which I have the whole entire 4 volumes here in my collection, and author of Great Change of Being, great book. And then he also studied at the same time with David Prall, P-R-A-L-L, who written a great deal about aesthetic theories and particularly value theory and aesthetic surfaces. So interesting to me. But at the same time, I know he also was a great reader of Whitehead. Whitehead was there for a long time, and I know when I participate in the panel at the Menil Institute, I brought up Whitehead being at Harvard. First thing he came to Harvard in 1924, he say half of the library books in Harvard Library should be thrown out. But which half? It's interesting because the thing about, I don't want to make a long summary of process philosophy, but one of the things that process philosophy, which I know he admire, is based on the dynamicity of the genuine experience in life, why you accumulate in your own experience and yourself allowing yourself to be part of the becoming. So in other words, it's a double task. And I'm very interested in the idea of double tasking, you know. And I wanted to ask you, how much was it that from the get-go that whether he were thinking of collage and taking synthetic cubism at the same time? Because synthetic cubism was so, I would say, easily misunderstood because everybody was doing it in New York at the same time. There was, of course, the AA, the AAA, you know, the American Abstract Impressionist Association, but thinking in terms of Gorky, you know, and I know he had a relation with also Gorky. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Katy and Tim particularly. Wasn't Diary of Seducer the painting, Gorky, the great painting painted in 45 at MoMA, which named after, of course, Soren Kierkegaard, the Seducer's Diary. So it's reversed. Wasn't that Motherwell who gave him that name? So that's my number one question. And number two is that whether talk about synthetic cubism, because I feel synthetic cubism to the arrival of his collage is such an interesting process of becoming, because there's nobody make collage like Motherwell. I don't think anybody after Picasso collage have elevated the art of collage in such height as Motherwell did. So I wanted to see whether you can comment on that, you know, what, because thinking about 1940 till 45, that's a brief time to absorb synthetic cubism. It's not that long, you know. So I'm curious whether Katy or Tim or you can, and Jennifer or Jan have anything to add to this, as well as you, Marianne. Let's go with Katy first.
I was wondering, actually, Tim, if you have any sense of the Gorky title question.
I have not read that anywhere in Motherwell's writings or interviews. His connection with Gorky was really sort of, in that early period with Mata, when they were trying to kind of build this movement in America to sort of overtake the older surrealists, and they were trying to enlist Gorky. And, Motherwell went to him with his ideas about automatism with Mata and tried to engage him. And at that moment, Gorky was interested, but not particularly interested in this sort of movement. But he kept up, Gorky kept up a conversation with Mata, and very, controversially among maybe some of Gorky's older peers, Harold Rosenberg and de Kooning and James Brooks. Motherwell really keyed in on that moment or that encounter over that, few months in, say, 42, 43, between Gorky and Mata's ideas of automatism, with really transforming Gorky's whole role as an artist, and really like the great late Gorky works, sort of he credits to that beginning where he uses automatism to sort of leave behind his influences, because Gorky was a great student of Miro and Picasso and Cézanne, and working through the sort of history of modernism in his own work, and really came into himself as a great individual, a great painter. But Motherwell also saw him as much more within the surrealist tradition than the abstract expressionist. And I think that was more of a social thing, because Gorky moved up to Connecticut to be near Tanguy and Calder and this sort of Connecticut. But in terms of the Kierkegaard, I think Kierkegaard was just in 45, Kierkegaard, I think, was really like becoming this sort of the currency. I know Rosenberg wrote an essay on Kierkegaard at that time, and there's a period, particularly say from the late 40s, even though it continues as a reference throughout his life, there's a period where after Prahl and Whitehead, there's say late 40s to the late 50s, Kierkegaard is the primary reference in Motherwell's discussions of the role of the relation of the artist in society, the relation of the artist to his medium. So I think maybe it was just something in the air, but Motherwell was very much aware of Gorky's, very taken in by Gorky's use of that title.
Right.
I know we don't have a lot of time, but Fong, I really love that phrase of allowing yourself to become a part of the becoming, especially as related to Motherwell's collage during that period, because of course, Motherwell doesn't decide until summer 1941 to become an artist. And he started making his first collages in 43 at the suggestion of Peggy Guggenheim. And he made his first collages with Jackson Pollock in Pollock's studio. And Motherwell's one of the few abstract expressionists who continued to make collages for the rest of his life. And he talks about it being sort of a core principle for him, not just in the artworks, but in his life. And we see that Tim mentioned the Dada painters and poets. Those texts are in many ways collaged. And to go back to that idea of the relationship between writing, Motherwell would write these texts and he would pin them up on the studio wall, and he talks about moving them around visually to put them in that order. So collage is really one of the most important media for Motherwell, and both in terms of his artistic practice, but also his thinking.
Katy, this just is something that just occurred to me when I think of collage, and when we think of the physical act of collage, the bringing together of disparate elements. And maybe Marianne would have something to say about this, or even Jennifer Field. But when you read his article on David Smith in Vogue in February '65, and he mentions how David Smith says, well, I don't read French, so Mallarmé, Rimbaud, they don't matter to me, it's James Joyce. And then you think of James Joyce, you think of Ulysses and the compound words, river run, right? And you think of how collage also builds these compound structures from disparate elements. And I'm wondering, if, again, I respect, clearly all art historical precursors, but I also wonder if this is a moment during which we actually have to just look at literature.
Yeah, it's so interesting you mentioned that, because, when we go back and rereading the genesis of Guernica 37, one of the things that is so compelling when Picasso for the first time became part of Surrealist circle, and I think he became a member soon after that, maybe even prior. But the fact that he allowed himself to explore automatism and allow himself to draw as fast as children would draw, And one of the images that compellingly stayed in my mind forever was the image of on the side of the bowl, there came forth a tiny Pegasus, remember, which came in and out in so many different permutations. In the end, he didn't really use it, but Pegasus, when you think of it, the symbol of lightness, but born out of the blood of Medusa. So it's the opposite of gravity, darkness, And the reason why I'm so interested in Motherwell in that period, how fast he had gained the deep understanding of synthetic cubism. When you think of 41 to 45, whatnot, when Mondrian came and Alex Trumbull Mason, they created that Abstract American Artists Association and became a kind of almost I don't want to be so critical, use the word academic cubism, but there was a lot of them were painted in that way. I brought up Gorky particularly because he's the first one who really assimilate synthetic cubism as a part of his nature. You remember he said, I was with Cézanne for a long time. I'm naturally now with Picasso. So there was that. But Motherwell, on the other hand, able to adapt Cubist language. That's why I'm interested in the idea of double task in a way, you know. So is it true, or in your own estimation, Marianne and Kenneth and everyone else here, double task here for him, would it mean synthetic cubism with lightness, not the heaviness, which everybody was after, the painted surface and everything had to be so well thought out and heavily studied. He was able to use that double task through synthetic understanding, but then with lightness. Would that lightness come through his interest in symbolic poetry, for example, or process philosophy? So those are two things that I was thinking, just listening to you just now. It may be another discussion one day. I don't know.
I would love that, Phong, but it seems to me that lightness, precisely that kind of, every discussion I had with Motherwell was like that. It would be serious but light, and then his passion for words. I mean, we're talking about his passion for poetry, which was great. I mean, Mallarmé. So we spent hours discussing my translations of Mallarmé, and he was so adept. He was so rapid in his slow consideration of Mallarmé's interior gravity, which was lightness, that kind of ambiguity that Katy was discussing. And, you know, that ambivalence was also his power of going from one thing to another, like genre to another. So I think that lightness is just fantastic.
Thank you. Just jumping in here, thank you so much, Phong. Those were some incredible questions. And thank you, Marianne, and everyone for those answers. We just want to bring our attention to the poetry reading that will be concluding this incredible event today. So we have a tradition at the Rail of concluding our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm so thrilled to welcome our Poet Laureate of the Day, Oscar Vargas, to the stage. Oscar Vargas is a Mexican-American writer based in Bushwick, Brooklyn, where he has lived his whole life. He completed his MFA in poetry at Brooklyn College in 2019. Currently, he is working as a part-time adjunct instructor and full-time corporate digital manager. His poetry reflects the experiences gained by traveling back and forth to Mexico in his childhood and growing up in a gentrifying Bushwick. And we're so grateful to have you here, Oscar, to read, and I'm now going to pass it over to you.
First of all, thank you, everybody, for wonderful discussion. It's an honor and a privilege to be here and have the opportunity to kind of round things out here. So on my end, interdisciplinary practice has always been an interesting point of study, if not one that I can necessarily act myself. For sure, I cannot draw at all, but I've always been fascinated by the concept of it, of artists and drawers of all kinds. And any opportunity that I get to engage with an artist is always fulfilling in that regard. To that point, I feel something that aligns pretty well with the discussion on Motherwell here is a short novel that I keep in constant rotation within my own classroom, which is The Little Prince, fellow French artist, who I feel is written such a beautiful piece of work, but it's beautiful in its simplicity, I feel. And to that end, I've also selected a couple of different poems that I feel align with this motif. Some simpler than others, but all concerned with attempts at capturing reality within art and all those different textures that we can find. So first up is Theory 1, Digging a Trench in the Outskirts of Puebla. You the dust, you the dirt of countryside fields. I'm the worker, you the summer rays painting. I dig into parched earth. You raise plumes of arid soil, the sun painting. Us, the dust, the dirt, you. Right. Theory 2, this rose is a book. And this book is a rose on the deconstruction of constellations into starfall. I've written a rose on deconstruction. Here's a postulation. Beautiful things are made to be placed behind gates. Elaboration. Wild colored street mulch roses illuminated by the lingering noon sun. Elaboration. The rainbow row of roses locked behind bars outside the rectory of St. Joseph's Catholic Church. Incarcerated, resilient, holy display. Elaboration. The passing of a grandmother whom I didn't know. Mother to the father I do not know, who abandoned the mother I barely know. That book has closed on everything but one memory, an impression of a neat yellow square patch. Theory 3, a ferocity teal. Before I lose the words, already slipping away, cigarettes and sweat interwoven into the smell of the earth, is my clumsiness in mannerism and expression. The rains, the rails, the clouds over 9 days, rough and an eternity, like the journey of a meteor into fiery dissolution, like the wishes we managed to cheat off the night. For example, a land-struck anchor, a harbor lit at night, an archaic sun rising again over the harbor, dissolving seamlessly into the sea, giving back imperfect, lovelier copies. Theory 4, of poetry, of art, of the sky, after Ronnie Caveda. The mapping of the stars onto the earth, visceral mimesis of worlds that were split by nature, not allowed to touch by a grand design. I can't recall any prehistoric myth that involves stars being brought down to earth that doesn't end in destruction, does not involve betrayal, that aren't harbingers of disaster. The stars move in unison across the expanse of our vision. Any attempt to capture them is sacrilege, the holy made commonplace, secular and godly. It is an incarnation of an impermissible power, the attempt to capture the star path, to bring luminosity down to earth, an art meant to blossom into wavelengths. Depending on time, I think I have 2 more, but I defer to the Brooklyn Rail here. All right. Miloxigenos. Axiom, all things come to an end. Idiom, all things come to an end. Expectation, all things come to an end. Experience, the empire coming to an end, dropping down with its line graphs that have gone up and down for years. But the analysts see a trend upwards, and the analysts of the analysts disagree. Entropy states that there cannot be endless growth. Los mil oxígenos. Emotion as crucial sensory of our bodies, language to input our bodies. Association emerges from our embodied experience. People are plants, and safety is warmth. Emotion and language are growth, are extensions of sensory motor memories. Conceptualization comes to play when our minds extend. Conceptualization comes to play when our minds intersect. Ideas, insights, sensory motor failings. Realities become individualized, supernatural, brought down to human scale. Dimensions of the sacred bleeding into fallible, empathetic attempts. Perspective demands we revisit people and plants and the evaluation of growth. 3,000 oxígenos. The graph represents 1,000 oxygens taken against their will. Are they breaths taken, or azaleas flowered, or molecules transformed? Bonding with filth, with something unnatural and out of place. The graph is sometimes displeasing, sometimes elating, often needs adjustment, often needs recreation, but invariably, the oxygen is lost, the oxygen is used, along with the revulsion of living 1,000 oxygens. Yet supply seems endless, as does the growth, as does the line on the graph, immortalized and using new air to do something new, to see something new. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oscar. That was really, really, really beautiful and such a great way to close this gorgeous and fruitful conversation today. Thank you again to Kenneth, Marianne, Tim, Jennifer, Maria, Jen, and Katy, as well as the rest of the February 2023 Critics Page contributors. And again, I encourage all of you to read the Critics Page on the Brooklyn Rail website or in print. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring this NSE program and for supporting our growing archive, where you can view this conversation and many others on the Rail's YouTube channel. For the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics in our monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. So please check the chat for a link to donate to support the Rail, and join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Leonie Geyer and Dory Bowen on the event of Nothing Kept Happening at Petra Bibeau Gallery in New York. We'll conclude tomorrow with a poetry reading by Leah Nibor. And you can now all turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful program today, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you. It was excellent.